Welcome back to Sci-Fi Traveler, friends. I have another great story for you. In this episode, we'll be listening to the story of Joseph and Haley. Sit back and close your eyes. Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. The thing about Proxima Terminal at 3 in the morning was that it had the specific soul-crushing ambience of every airport Joseph had ever suffered through, just with more neon and the occasional alien dignitary sweeping past in robes that probably cost more than his apartment. The ceilings were vaulted and luminous, cycling through a slow, blue-to-violet shift that someone in the design department had clearly believed was soothing. It was not soothing. It was the color of a headache. Joseph walked fast, coffee in his left hand, boarding pass in his right, bag slung over one shoulder in the optimistic way of a man who had packed for 3 days and was already regretting the extra pair of boots. The terminal was nearly empty at this hour, which meant his footsteps echoed in a way that felt personally judgmental. Gate 7, the departures board had said. Budget freighter to Callaway Station, departure 3:15. Simple. Manageable. The kind of trip a person took when the connecting flight fell through and the travel reimbursement was being handled by someone who genuinely did not like him. He passed Gate 14, Gate 15, Gate 16. His coffee was going cold. The boarding pass in his hand had a font size that bordered on cruel, and the ambient lighting was doing him absolutely no favors. Gate 17 appeared on his left, its signage glowing in that same pale blue as everything else in this terminal, and he turned through the open doors without breaking stride because he was a man with a mission, and the mission was to sit down as soon as physically possible. The airlock sealed behind him with a sound like a polite, definitive exhale. The corridor he stepped into did not look like any budget freighter he had ever booked. Budget freighters had the aesthetic of a storage unit that someone had reluctantly pressurized. They smelled like recycled air and old decisions. The corridor in front of Joseph was wide and clean and faintly luminous, the walls carrying a soft inner light that had no visible source. The floor smooth beneath his shoes in a way that suggested materials that did not exist in any catalog he had ever browsed. The air carried a scent he had no category for, something between rain on warm stone and a frequency rather than a smell, something that made the back of his mind sit up and take notice. He stood still for a moment. He looked behind him. The airlock was closed. He looked forward. The corridor curved gently ahead, disappearing around a bend, lit and quiet, and in absolutely no way resembling the Gate 7 departure he had booked 4 weeks ago using a discount code that had expired twice before finally working. Joseph took a sip of his coffee. It was cold. He walked forward, because walking forward is what a person does when the alternative is standing in a corridor doing nothing, and doing nothing had never once solved a logistical problem. The ship hummed around him, low, steady, a vibration more felt than heard, as though the vessel were breathing with considerable confidence in itself. He passed 3 doors, each sealed, each unmarked. He passed a junction where 2 corridors met, and a small alcove held something that might have been a water station and might have been modern art. He could not tell and did not stop to investigate. What he found at the end of the corridor was the common deck. It was a large open space, well lit and thoughtfully arranged, with seating that curved in soft arcs around a central area, surfaces that held equipment and instruments he could not name, and wide viewports along the far wall through which the stars were already moving in a way that confirmed, without any further need for discussion, that the ship had departed. Every face in the room turned toward him. There were perhaps a dozen of them, and they were all women, and they were all looking at him with an expression he had never personally received before. Somewhere between the focused attention of a scientist who has just noticed something unexpected in a controlled environment, and the polite bewilderment of someone who has found a cat sitting in the middle of their kitchen table, calm and completely without explanation. The skin tones in the room ranged from a soft pale rose to a deep, extraordinary cobalt. Hair moved in colors that had no agreed-upon names in any language Joseph spoke. And the ears, he noticed them only after a moment. The way you notice something that is slightly, but distinctly not what you expected, were slightly pointed at the tips. Elegant, subtle, easy to miss if you were not paying attention, and Joseph was now paying very close attention. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Joseph lifted his coffee cup in a gesture that was not quite a wave and not quite a toast, and was mostly just something to do with his hand. "I," he said, and then stopped because the sentence had several possible endings and none of them were going to help. One of the women near the back tilted her head approximately 4 degrees to the left. Another, seated closest to him, looked down at his boarding pass, still in his hand, still absolutely useless, and then back up at his face with the patient expression of someone waiting to see how this was going to develop. It was at this precise moment that Joseph accepted, with the quiet internal dignity of a man who had made peace with worse, that he had boarded the wrong ship. The departure boards Gate 7 and Gate 17 had been separated by a font, a lighting condition, and approximately 3 neurons worth of attention at 3 in the morning, and he had walked through the consequences of that arithmetic. The ship jumped. It was not violent. It was, in fact, almost gentle. A single moment where the stars outside the viewports rearranged themselves without commentary, where the hum of the engines rose and then settled into a new, deeper register, where Joseph's stomach made a brief and personal objection before deciding to let the matter go. The lights in the common deck dimmed by a fraction and then returned. Somewhere deeper in the ship, a soft tone rang once, like a bell that had been designed by someone who found regular bells too aggressive. 12 pairs of eyes remained on Joseph. He finished his cold coffee. She came from the corridor to his left, and she walked the way certain people walk when they have never once in their lives needed to hurry because the situation, whatever it was, would simply have to wait for them to arrive. She was tall. Not unreasonably so, but tall in the way that made Joseph aware of his own posture in a way he hadn't been since a job interview 8 years ago that had also not gone particularly well. Her skin was the deep, even blue of the ocean at a depth where light was still present but was clearly there under protest, and her hair was dark and pulled back with a practicality that suggested she had not dressed for company. Her ears, pointed at the tips, elegant, framing her face with a kind of effortless geometry, caught the light as she turned her head to take in the scene before her. She took in the common deck. She took in her crew, still arranged in their various poses of polite, scientific fascination. She took in Joseph, standing in the center of it all, with an empty coffee cup and the expression of a man assembling a legal defense in real time. She looked at him for a long moment with dark eyes that gave nothing away and took everything in. Then she said something in a language that moved through the air like water, finding the path of least resistance, all smooth consonants and vowels that seemed to carry more information than any individual sound had a right to. The crew responded. A few words, a gesture, one woman near the viewport holding up Joseph's boarding pass, which he had apparently dropped at some point and had not noticed because he had been busy experiencing his evening. The tall woman crossed the deck toward him with the same unhurried precision with which she had entered it. She stopped at a conversational distance, close enough to speak, far enough to make it clear that this was still her ship and he was a variable that had not yet been categorized. "You," she said, in standard that carried the faint musical trace of an accent he could not place, "are not on the manifest." "No," Joseph agreed. "I'm not." "Your boarding pass is for a freighter departing Gate 7. "Yes." She looked at him. She looked at the boarding pass in her crew member's hand. She looked back at him. "This is Gate 17. "I'm aware of that now." A pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable exactly, more the kind of pause that precedes a verdict. Joseph had the distinct impression that this woman had encountered problems before and had resolved every single one of them, and that she was currently deciding which category of problem he belonged to. He hoped it was the minor administrative kind and not the jettison at the next opportunity kind, though he thought it would be somewhat rude to ask. "I'm Joseph," he offered, because it seemed like a reasonable contribution to make. "Haley," she said. "Captain of this vessel." A beat. "The Alarin." Another beat, in which she appeared to be deciding how much additional information he had earned. "We are a research expedition, 11 days to deep space. The jump has already been completed." Joseph processed this. Is there a route back, or?" 11 days, Haley said again, with the gentle and absolute finality of a door being closed on a subject. He nodded slowly, in the way a person nods when they are accepting information that their body has not yet agreed to believe. 11 days. On a ship full of alien women who were still, collectively, watching him with the focused interest of academics who had found an unexpected specimen on the table at the start of a very important conference. He became aware again of his bag on his shoulder and his empty cup in his hand, and of the fact that he had not slept and that his body was beginning to file formal complaints about this. Haley turned to the crew and said something brief in her own language. Whatever it was, it redistributed the room. People returning to stations, to seats, to conversations, with the smooth efficiency of a group that trusted its captain's assessment of a situation even before that assessment had been fully articulated. The woman near the viewport set his boarding pass on the nearest surface and returned to a console that flickered with data in a script he didn't recognize. "You will need a cabin," Haley said, turning back to him. "I don't want to impose." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite its absence. Something precisely in the middle, a kind of controlled acknowledgement that the sentence he had just spoken was, under the circumstances, a fairly remarkable one. "You are already on the ship," she said. "In deep space, past the jump threshold." A pause. "The imposition has occurred." Joseph opened his mouth and then closed it again, because she was, point for point, entirely correct. "Fair enough," he said. She led him out of the common deck and into the corridor beyond, and he followed with the quiet, cooperative energy of a man who had decided that the best available strategy was to be as undisruptive as possible and to ask questions one at a time, starting with the most pressing and working downward. The corridor branched twice. She navigated it without hesitation, her stride even, her posture carrying the specific self-possession of someone who had never once second-guessed a direction. "How many crew?" Joseph asked. 14, Haley said. 15, currently. He let that land. "What do you study?" "The expedition, I mean." "Stellar phenomena, biological variants across deep space environments, gravitational behavior near certain classes of star." She said it the way people describe their work when the work is genuinely interesting to them, and they have learned to summarize it for audiences who lack the relevant vocabulary, among other things. "I'm a logistics coordinator," Joseph said, and then immediately regretted volunteering it, because it sounded, next to stellar phenomena and gravitational behavior, like something a person apologized for at dinner parties. Haley glanced at him once, briefly, from the corner of those dark eyes. "Logistics," she said, with a very small, very precise pause before the word that he could not fully interpret. That may be useful. He couldn't tell if she meant it. He suspected she did, which was somehow more disorienting than if she hadn't. She stopped before a door, pressed 2 fingers to a panel beside it, and it slid open onto a small, clean cabin with a bunk, a surface that served as a desk, and a viewport through which the stars outside were the cold, ancient, absolute stars of deep space. Nothing between him and them but a few inches of hull material and the vast, indifferent dark. "Rest," Haley said. "There will be a meal in 2 hours." She left. The door closed. Joseph sat on the bunk, set his empty coffee cup on the desk with the care of a man placing the last piece of evidence in a case against himself, and looked out at the stars for a long time without thinking anything in particular. Then he lay back, closed his eyes, and was asleep in under 4 minutes, which was, given the circumstances, either a testament to his adaptability or a strong indication that his body had simply refused to engage further with the events of the evening without adequate rest. He dreamed of boarding passes. The font was enormous. It didn't help. He woke to light. Not the aggressive, fluorescent ambush of a budget freighter's morning cycle, which Joseph had experienced twice before and compared, on both occasions, to being personally accused by a lamp. This was something gentler, a gradual brightening through the viewport, as though the ship itself had decided to ease him back into consciousness with some degree of consideration. The stars outside had not changed, of course. Stars at this depth of space did not do gradual. But the cabin's interior lighting had shifted from the dim blue of sleep hours to a warmer tone that suggested, without insisting, that the day had begun and it might be reasonable to participate in it. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, conducting the brief internal inventory that the human mind performs every morning, the few seconds in which it reassembles the previous day's events and presents them, one by one, for review. He had missed his freighter. He was on an alien research vessel. He had 11 days, 10 now, until the ship reached its destination, at which point no one had specified what would happen to him. The captain was named Haley, was blue, and had described his presence on her ship as an imposition that had already occurred, which was technically the most accurate and least comforting thing anyone had said to him in recent memory. He sat up. His bag was where he'd left it. His empty coffee cup was on the desk, patient as an accusation. He found, to his mild surprise, that a folded item had been placed on the chair beside the door at some point while he slept. A garment of some kind, simple and dark, clearly not his. Practical, ship-appropriate. Someone had thought about this, which meant someone had made a decision about him continuing to be on this ship, which meant the situation had a shape, even if he couldn't see it fully yet. He changed. The garment fit well enough, which was either coincidence or a level of observational precision that he chose not to examine too closely before breakfast. The common deck was quieter in the ship's morning than it had been the night before, occupied by only a few crew members who were eating, working, or doing both simultaneously in the focused way of people who found interruption more exhausting than efficiency. Joseph stood in the entrance for a moment, aware that his arrival registered, not dramatically, not with the full collective attention of the previous night, but in the small peripheral way of a room that has noted something without making a formal announcement about it. A woman detached herself from the nearest table and approached him with the comfortable directness of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity and had prepared for it. She was shorter than Haley, her skin a warm rose gold that caught the light differently at different angles, her pointed ears framed by hair that moved in a deep amber that Joseph's brain kept trying to classify as a color he already knew and kept failing. She was carrying 2 containers that steamed faintly and held them out with the expectant expression of someone presenting credentials. "You are Joseph," she said. It wasn't a question. News, apparently, traveled efficiently on a ship with 14 crew members and 1 accidental passenger. "That's me," he confirmed. "I am Nova," she said. "I study biological systems. You are a biological system I have not encountered before." She said this with such complete, cheerful sincerity that Joseph found it impossible to be unsettled by it. "I thought you might want something to eat while I asked you questions. This seemed like an efficient arrangement." He accepted one of the containers. It was warm in his hands and smelled extraordinary. Something layered and savory, with an undertone he had no reference point for, which was becoming a theme. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "Gentle ones," Nova said, sitting down at the table she had come from and gesturing at the seat across from her with the confidence of someone who has already decided the answer is yes. "I am curious about your biology. Your ear shape, mostly, and your coloring, and your size. You are somewhat larger than expected, proportionally. Also, your hands." Joseph sat down. He looked at his hands. They appeared to him to be ordinary hands. "What about them?" 5 digits, she said, leaning forward slightly. "All of similar length. The ratio is interesting." She produced a small device from somewhere and set it on the table between them, clearly with the intention of taking notes, and then appeared to remember something. "I should say, this is not an examination. You do not have to answer. I have been told I sometimes approach people like they are research subjects, which I understand is not always comfortable." A brief pause. "Are you comfortable?" "Surprisingly, yes," Joseph said, and meant it. There was something so straightforward about her curiosity that it bypassed whatever defensive instinct the situation might otherwise have triggered. She wasn't studying him. She was interested in him, which was a different thing, and the distinction mattered. They ate together, and she asked her gentle questions, and he answered them, and somewhere in the middle of it, he began asking questions back. About the ship's biosystems, about how the life support calibrated for different physiologies, about what the food was and whether he should be concerned. She said no, it had been checked, which implied someone had checked it before he woke up, which again implied a level of prior decision-making that he noted and filed away. Nova answered everything with the same bright, unguarded enthusiasm, occasionally pausing mid-sentence to correct herself when she veered into terminology that required a shared scientific vocabulary he did not possess. He was on his 2nd container of food when the navigator arrived. She was tall and angular, her skin a soft silver gray, her posture carrying the particular stillness of someone who spent most of their professional life reading data and had made peace with the fact that the universe was mostly numbers. She sat down without introduction, placed a flat display on the table, and turned it toward Joseph without preamble. "You are going to Callaway Station," she said. "I am Stella. I navigate this vessel." She tapped the display. On it was a star map, rendered in 3 dimensions, rotating slowly, a network of routes and waypoints spread across a volume of space that made Joseph feel, briefly, like a very small object in a very large room, which he was. "Your original destination is here." A point lit up. "We are currently here." Another point lit up, at a distance that required a moment to absorb. "That's far," Joseph said. "Yes," Stella said. "How far?" "From our current trajectory and destination, a return to Callaway Station would require a route adjustment that is not available to us for," she checked the display, "approximately 43 days. Joseph looked at the star map. He looked at Nova, who gave him the sympathetic expression of a person who already knew this and had timed his breakfast accordingly, which he suspected she had. He looked back at Stella. 43 days, he repeated. "From our destination," Stella said, "after the 11 days of transit, so 54 days total from now." She said it with the clean, undecorated delivery of someone for whom numbers were neither good nor bad, but simply accurate. "This is not a problem we can solve faster. Space is very large." "It really is," Joseph agreed quietly. Stella picked up her display, nodded once at Nova with the efficiency of 2 people who had coordinated this conversation in advance, and left. Joseph watched her go and then turned back to his food, which was still excellent, and which he focused on for a moment because it was the most straightforwardly positive element currently available to him. 54 days, he said, mostly to himself. "The ship is comfortable," Nova offered. "And the crew is, we are all curious about you. In a kind way." She considered this. "Most of us." "Most?" "Mila does not like surprises," Nova said, with the tone of someone being diplomatically accurate. "She will come around. She came around about the gravitational anomaly in Sector 12, and that took significantly longer than you will." Joseph looked at her. "Should I be comforted by being compared favorably to a gravitational anomaly?" Nova considered the question with the seriousness it did not deserve. "Yes," she decided. "I think so. The anomaly was genuinely very difficult." He laughed. It came out before he'd decided to, sudden and real and slightly helpless, and Nova looked pleased in the specific way of someone who had hoped for exactly that outcome. Outside the viewport, the stars moved slowly past, indifferent and ancient and impossibly numerous. Inside, the ship hummed its steady hum. Joseph finished his breakfast on a vessel 11 days deep in space, 54 days from the nearest route home, and found, against all reasonable expectation, that he was doing something close to fine. By the 3rd day, Joseph had developed a routine. This was, he recognized, a very Joseph thing to do. Faced with circumstances entirely outside his control, a wrong gate, a sealed airlock, 54 days of deep space between himself and anything resembling a normal Tuesday, his instincts had responded not with panic or existential paralysis, but with the calm, slightly stubborn insistence on structure that had carried him through every logistical disaster of his professional life. You made a schedule. You found the rhythms of the place. You figured out where the coffee equivalent was kept, and you made sure you knew the route to it before anything else. The coffee equivalent, as it turned out, was a dark, dense liquid dispensed from a station near the common deck's entrance, prepared from something Nova had described with great enthusiasm using 3 words Joseph didn't know, and one he did: fermented, which he had decided to simply accept without further investigation. It was good, better than good, on some mornings. He drank it from a wide, low cup that one of the crew had left out for him after the first day, without comment, as though it had always been there, and he had learned not to examine the small kindnesses too closely, because examining them made him feel things he hadn't budgeted time for. Mornings he spent in the common deck, which emptied out after the first hour as crew filtered toward their stations. He had been given access to a terminal, a careful, limited access, Haley had specified, which he had assured her was more than sufficient. And he used it to read what he could of the expedition's publicly shared research, translating where the system allowed and guessing where it didn't. It kept his mind occupied in the particular way that logistics minds need to be occupied, moving pieces around, finding the shape of a system. The Alarin was an extraordinarily well-organized vessel. He noticed this the way a musician notices tuning, automatically, appreciatively, without being able to fully turn it off. Afternoons belonged to whoever found him first. This had not been a formal arrangement. It had simply evolved. The way things evolve on ships where the population is small and the distance between any 2 points is never more than a few minutes' walk. On the third day, it was Nova again, who had further questions about his hands and also wanted to show him something in the biolab, which turned out to be a specimen tank containing something that pulsed with a slow, bioluminescent rhythm, and which Nova described as essentially a very simple organism, and which Joseph described privately as the single most beautiful and unsettling thing he had ever seen, in the specific way that deep-sea creatures are beautiful and unsettling, as though beauty and unsettling are not opposites, but simply different expressions of the same fundamental strangeness. On the fourth day, it was Stella, who did not waste time on social preamble and had apparently decided that since Joseph was going to be on the ship for an extended period, he might as well understand the navigation systems at a functional level. She taught him to read the star charts, real ones, three-dimensional and rotating, dense with data that painted the space around them in colors corresponding to gravitational fields, radiation levels, the drift of interstellar material across distances that made the word vast feel like an understatement that should probably apologize for itself. He was not fast at it. He told her so. She told him that speed was irrelevant and accuracy was everything, which he suspected was also her philosophy on most other topics, and he appreciated it. It was on the fourth afternoon, somewhere between Stella's explanation of a particularly unusual stellar formation, a binary system locked in a gravitational embrace so precise it had been used as a navigational reference point across 6 different civilizations, that Mila walked into the room. She stopped when she saw Joseph. He had not met Mila yet, but he knew who she was immediately, partly because Nova's description had been accurate, and partly because the expression she wore was not hostile exactly, but was the specific expression of a person who had organized the world according to certain expectations and found the current situation failing to meet them. She was compact and precise-looking, her skin a deep forest green, her dark eyes moving from Stella to Joseph and back to Stella with the rapid assessment of someone running calculations. "You are teaching him the charts," she said to Stella. "He asked," Stella said. Which was true. Mila looked at Joseph. "You asked." "It seemed useful to know where I am," Joseph said carefully. A pause in which Mila appeared to evaluate this answer against a fairly rigorous internal standard. "You can't read the coordinate system," she said. "Your notation is different." "Stella's been translating." Said Mila, which was not agreement and not disagreement, but something that lived between them, waiting to see what happened next. She moved to a console on the far side of the room, pulled up something Joseph couldn't see from his angle, and did not leave. This was, Nova had implied, progress. The gravitational anomaly from Sector 12 had reportedly made her leave the room entirely for the first 3 days. That evening, Joseph ate dinner in the common deck with 6 crew members and a conversation that moved between 3 languages. The crew's own, which he was beginning to recognize patterns in without yet being able to follow, a trade language that several of them shared and that sat closer to something his ear could track, and Standard, which they switched into for his benefit without being asked and without making a production of it. He contributed where he could. He listened where he couldn't. He learned that the woman with copper-toned skin and the habit of speaking with her hands was called Arya and was the ship's engineer, that she had opinions about the Alarin's secondary propulsion system that she was willing to share at length and with considerable passion, and that those opinions were apparently well-founded because Stella kept nodding at the technical parts without interrupting. He was reaching for his cup when Haley sat down across from him. She did not do it dramatically. She simply arrived at the table the way she arrived everywhere, as if she had always intended to be precisely there, set down her own meal. and began eating with the focused, efficient attention of someone who treated food as a system to be processed rather than an experience to be had, which Joseph found oddly endearing. He had spent 4 days watching her move through the ship and had begun to understand that she operated at a frequency slightly above the immediate, always thinking 2 or 3 decisions ahead, the kind of person who was never surprised because she had already considered the surprise and decided how to handle it. "You have been useful," she said, without looking up from her meal. Joseph blinked. "I have. The supply inventory for the research equipment, the cross-referencing system you restructured on the terminal." She did look up now, briefly, with those dark eyes that remained, 4 days in, genuinely difficult to read. It was more efficient. He had done that quietly, in the morning hours, half because his logistics instincts couldn't leave a disorganized system alone, and half because he had wanted to contribute something, and it was the only tool he had reliably available. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. "I wasn't sure if it was appropriate," he said, "touching the systems." "You had access," Haley said simply. "You used it well." A pause. "I do not give compliments I don't mean." "I'm getting that impression," Joseph said, and something in his tone must have been right because the corner of her mouth moved, fractionally, briefly, in a way that he was almost certain was a smile, or the outermost edge of one. They ate in a companionable quiet for a few minutes, the conversation of the other crew members moving around them like water around 2 stones. "Can I ask you something?" Joseph said. Haley considered the question before he had asked it. "You may." "The expedition. What you're going to study when we get there." He nodded at the general direction of wherever the ship was heading, which he now knew from Stella's charts was a cluster of 3 stars in a configuration that occurred nowhere else in the mapped region of space. "What do you actually expect to find?" Haley was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't know, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of what they know they would like to share. "Something we don't have words for yet," she said finally. "That is the honest answer. The equipment has categories, the research has parameters. But the thing itself..." She paused. "You plan for the known. You go for what isn't." Joseph looked at her. Outside the viewport behind her, the stars were dense and still and absolutely indifferent, burning at distances that made every human measure of time feel like a polite fiction. He thought about Gate 7 and Gate 17. He thought about half-second decisions. He thought about the way certain things in life, the good ones and the terrible ones, and sometimes both at once, arrived not because you planned for them, but because you took a wrong turn at 3 in the morning and kept walking. "Yeah," he said, "I think I understand that." Haley looked at him for a moment with an expression he was only beginning to have the vocabulary for. Then she returned to her meal, and he returned to his, and the ship moved through the dark with the quiet confidence of something that knew exactly where it was going and had decided collectively that everyone on board was exactly where they were supposed to be. The card game had no name, or rather it had a name in the crew's language that Joseph could not pronounce without Nova covering her mouth to suppress what she insisted was not laughter and was very clearly laughter. He called it 11 because there were 11 cards in a hand and because naming things was how he managed them. And the name stuck with a speed that suggested the crew had been waiting for someone to simply decide what to call it and move on. The rules, as far as Joseph had been able to reconstruct them from 3 days of observation and one long, patient explanation from Stella that had been more thorough than helpful, were as follows. Each player held 11 cards carrying symbols that corresponded to values that shifted depending on which phase of the round you were in, and the phases were determined by a central draw that operated on a logic Joseph had described as completely arbitrary and Stella had described as mathematically precise, and they had agreed to disagree. You won by achieving a configuration called, in translation, something like the right arrangement at the right moment, which Nova said was a beautiful description of the game's philosophy and Joseph said was the least useful definition of winning he had ever encountered. He had lost 4 times before winning once. And the once had been sufficiently surprising to everyone, including himself, that Arya had looked up from her console on the far side of the common deck to see what the noise was about. It was on the 7th day that Mila sat down to play. She did it without announcement, pulling out a chair with the decisive movement of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it, and arranged her cards with a precision that suggested she had been watching the games from a distance and had already calculated her strategy. She did not look at Joseph directly. She looked at her cards. He looked at his. They played. Mila was extraordinarily good at 11. This was, in retrospect, not surprising. She was the ship's chief scientist, a woman who had spent her career finding patterns in phenomena that didn't want to be found, and 11 rewarded exactly that kind of mind. She won the first round efficiently and without visible satisfaction, which somehow made it worse than if she had gloated. The second round she won more slowly, which Joseph gradually realized was because she was paying attention not just to her own hand, but to how he played his, cataloging his decisions with the same focused interest she presumably brought to research data. After the third round, which Joseph lost in a way that suggested he had at least understood what he was doing wrong, even if he couldn't yet do it right, Mila set down her cards and looked at him directly for the first time since sitting down. "You adapt," she said. "Your strategy changes between rounds." "I'm trying to learn the game," Joseph said. "Most people do not change strategy that quickly," she said. "They repeat the approach that failed, slightly modified, 2 or 3 times before abandoning it." She said it without judgment, purely as an observation, the way she might note the behavior of the bioluminescent organism in Nova's tank. "You abandoned it immediately." "In logistics, if something isn't working, you stop doing it," Joseph said. "The situation costs more the longer you wait." Mila considered this with the expression of someone filing information in a specific location for later retrieval. "That is a reasonable philosophy," she said, which from Mila, Nova had assured him, was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. She stayed for 2 more rounds. She won both. She left without saying goodbye, which Nova had also assured him was not personal, but simply how Mila ended interactions she considered complete. Joseph watched her go and then looked at Nova. "Progress?" he asked. "Enormous," Nova said, with total sincerity. The 7th day also brought the observation deck. He had found it by accident, a wrong turn on the way back from the cargo level where Arya had been showing him the secondary propulsion array, which was as impressive as her opinions about it had suggested, and which operated on a principle Joseph understood only in the broadest metaphorical sense, something to do with the way the ship negotiated with local space rather than simply pushing against it, which Arya described with the animated joy of someone explaining something they loved to someone who could not quite reach it but was genuinely trying to. The wrong turn had led to a narrow corridor, the corridor to a hatch, and the hatch to a small domed space that sat above the main hull like a thought the ship was having privately. The dome was transparent, not glass, something that had no distortion, no edge, no sense of barrier, so that sitting inside it felt less like looking through a window and more like floating in open space with the minor but significant advantage of being able to breathe. The stars here were different from the viewport in his cabin. More of them, at this angle, the density of the deep field laid out in every direction without the frame that a rectangular window imposed. The galaxy's arm was visible as a band of accumulated light, ancient and enormous, and apparently unbothered by how it made a person feel. Joseph sat there for a long time without moving. He was still there when Haley found him, which seemed to be a pattern that the ship encouraged, Haley finding him in various states of stillness in various corridors and spaces, as though the Alaran were periodically arranging these encounters the way a host arranges furniture. She stood at the hatch for a moment before entering, which he noticed because Haley did not usually pause. "You found the observation deck," she said. "I got lost," he said. "It worked out." She came in and sat, not beside him, but near enough that the dome enclosed them both, the stars visible in every direction above and around them. She was quiet for a moment, looking outward, and he had the sense that this was not a place she brought people, and also not a place she kept to herself, but something in between that didn't have a clean category. "Do you know that formation?" He gestured toward the band of light. "What it looks like from here." "The drift," she said. "That is what we call it, the slow current of it. It moves, not on any scale you can watch, but the models show it. Everything in that band is going somewhere, slowly, and has been going there since before there were eyes to notice it was moving. That's either very comforting or very unsettling, Joseph said. Yes, Haley agreed, which was, he had learned, exactly the kind of answer she gave when she thought a thing was true in both directions simultaneously. They sat with it for a while. Outside, a light moved. Not a star, something transient, something crossing their field of view at a distance Stella could probably have named precisely, and he could only estimate as enormous. "Can I ask you something?" he said. It had become, without formal designation, the phrase he used with her to signal that what followed might require more than a logistical answer. She had begun, he thought, to recognize it. "You may," she said, as she always did. "The word," he said, "that you used with Nova, when she asked what I was, on the ship, the word in your language." He had heard it in passing, 3 days ago, a single word dropped in a quiet exchange, and Nova's expression after it, and Haley moving on before he could ask. "What does it mean?" Haley was quiet. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer, he had learned to tell the difference, but the quiet of someone choosing which part of a true answer to begin with. "It is not a single concept," she said finally. "It is the word for something that arrives outside the expected order and becomes part of the pattern regardless." A pause. "In research, we use it for a variable that should not be significant but determines the outcome. In navigation, for a star that should not be visible from a given point, but is." She looked at him then, directly, with those dark eyes that had taken him 7 days to begin reading. "In ordinary life, we use it less often." Joseph absorbed this. Outside, the stars burned their ancient light across distances that made the word ordinary feel like the most interesting word in any language. "In ordinary life," he said carefully. "What does it mean then?" Haley looked back at the stars. The pointed tips of her ears caught the distant light. "Someone," she said, "who was not in the plan." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight and temperature and a very specific shape, the kind that asks nothing and says everything and sits between two people like a third presence that both of them have decided, without discussion, to leave undisturbed for now. Joseph looked at the drift. The slow, ancient current of the galaxy's arm, moving toward somewhere it had always been going, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the plans of the small, warm things moving through it. 7 more days, he said. Not because it was news, but because it was what he was thinking. 7, Haley confirmed, and said nothing else, and stayed. The research station orbited a planet whose atmosphere glowed amber at the edges. Joseph stood at the viewport in his cabin on the morning of the 11th day and looked at it for a long time without moving. The planet was not large by any technical measure. Stella had given him the precise dimensions 4 days ago with the specific pleasure she took in sharing accurate information. But it had the quality that certain things have of being exactly as large as they need to be. No more. The amber light at its rim pulsing faintly with the slow breath of atmospheric chemistry that Nova had explained in detail and that Joseph had understood as alive, in the way that systems are alive, in the way that things with their own rhythms and temperatures and inner logics are alive, which is a different kind of alive from breathing but not necessarily lesser. The station was visible now too. A structure in high orbit, angular and deliberate, its running lights moving in a slow rotation that matched the planet's pull. It was larger than it had looked in Stella's charts. Most things were. He had packed his bag the night before. This was the kind of thing Joseph did. Anticipated the transition, prepared for it, had everything in order before it arrived. The bag sat on the bunk with his boarding pass folded on top of it. The one for the freighter that had left Proxima Terminal 11 days ago without him and had presumably arrived at Callaway Station and unloaded whatever it was carrying and moved on. The way things do when you are not on them. He looked at the boarding pass. He picked it up. He put it in his pocket. He went to breakfast. The common deck was full, which was unusual for morning. The crew had apparently arrived collectively and without coordination, which meant, he had learned, that it had been coordinated entirely in a language and through channels he didn't have access to. Arya had made something with the galley equipment that produced a smell so good it could have been used as a navigational beacon. Nova had arranged cups in a configuration that ensured everyone would reach for one. Even Mila was there, seated at the end of the table with her precise posture and her careful expression. And when Joseph walked in, she looked at him and gave him a single deliberate nod, which from Mila was roughly equivalent to a farewell speech with footnotes. He sat down. Someone passed him food. Stella placed a star chart in front of him, a physical print, which she had clearly done on purpose. The route of the last 11 days traced in the blue ink used for completed trajectories. He looked at it. The distance between where he had been and where he was covered a span of space that made the word journey feel inadequate in an almost funny way. "For your records," Stella said, with the practicality of someone who gave gifts the way they did everything else, straightforwardly and without ceremony. "Thank you," he said, and meant it at a depth the words didn't quite reach. The meal moved the way the last meal of something always moves, with a quality of attention that isn't quite sadness but sits in the same neighborhood, everyone slightly more present than usual, the conversation carrying an undertone of things not quite being said. Arya talked about the secondary propulsion refinements she intended to propose to the station's engineering team. Nova said something in her own language that made 3 people laugh and then translated it for Joseph as a description of the bioluminescent organism's behavior that morning, which had apparently been dramatic and which he was sorry to have missed. Even this, the small, ordinary texture of the ship's morning, the cups and the laughter and the smell of Arya's cooking, had become at some point he hadn't noticed something he would carry. He was reaching for his cup when he realized Haley was not there. He didn't say anything. He finished breakfast. He helped carry things back to the galley station, which he had started doing on the 4th day without being asked, and which had become simply part of how the morning ended. He said his goodbyes. Nova held his hands in both of hers for a moment in what he had learned was a gesture of warm regard, looking at his 5 evenly proportioned fingers with an expression that managed to be simultaneously scientific and fond. Arya punched him lightly on the arm, which was not a gesture from her culture but one she had learned from watching him and deployed with the deliberate warmth of someone using a borrowed language to say something true. Stella gave him another nod, precise and complete. Mila, as he passed her, said, "Your card strategy improved significantly." "I had good teachers," he said. Something moved in her expression, brief, controlled, and real. "Yes," she said. "We did." He picked up his bag. He walked to the docking corridor. Haley was there. She was standing at the junction where the main corridor met the docking arm, arms crossed in the way she had, which he now understood was not a closed posture but simply how she stood when she was thinking at the edge of a decision. She was looking at the docking arm. She turned when she heard him. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which with Haley was never empty. It was always the shape of something. "I wanted to see you off," she said. "I noticed you weren't at breakfast," he said. "I was here," she said. "I find departure protocols more manageable when I approach them from the end rather than the beginning." He looked at her. "That is the most Haley sentence you have ever said to me." The corner of her mouth moved, the fraction of a smile that he had catalogued 11 times across 11 days and still found new each time. "I have been told," she said. He shifted his bag on his shoulder. The docking arm beyond them connected to the station, which connected to whatever came next. A berth, a communication line back to somewhere that had his name on a manifest. The long reorientation of returning to a life he had left accidentally and was returning to deliberately, which was a different thing entirely, and he was not yet sure what to do with the difference. "The word," he said. "Someone who was not in the plan." Haley looked at him steadily. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "About plans. I had one. Gate 7, Callaway Station, 3 days. Back to the same work in the same city doing the same logistics for people who sent feedback forms instead of thank you notes." He paused. "I'm not certain that plan was working." "Plans often persist," Haley said, "past the point of their usefulness. Yours doesn't seem to." "I have learned to distinguish," she said, "between a plan and a direction. A plan breaks when conditions change. A direction holds. She looked at him with those dark eyes that he had spent 11 days learning and would spend considerably longer understanding. You have good direction, Joseph. He thought about gate 7 and gate 17. He thought about a half second at 3 in the morning, a cold coffee, and an impossible font, the particular arithmetic of a small mistake that opens a large door. He thought about bioluminescent organisms and star charts printed in blue ink and a card game with no name that he had finally, on the 9th day, won twice in a row. He thought about sitting in a dome of stars with a woman who had not been in any plan he had ever made and who had said something true about him on the 7th day that he would probably still be thinking about in 20 years. He put his hand in his pocket. He felt the boarding pass. The useless, outdated, wrong gate boarding pass that had started all of this. He took it out. He looked at it one more time, at the font that had required better lighting than Proxima Terminal provided at 3 in the morning, at the gate number that was not the gate he had walked through. He held it out to Haley. She took it. She looked at it with the careful attention she gave everything, reading what she could and inferring the rest. "Keep it," he said, "for your records. Unexpected variables and all that." Something happened in her expression, not the fraction of a smile this time, but something deeper, something that lived behind the careful management of her face and came forward briefly and completely before she allowed it to settle. She folded the boarding pass once precisely and put it in the chest pocket of her uniform. Then she uncrossed her arms and stood at her full height and looked at him in the way of a person who is about to say something they have already decided and has been waiting for the right geometry of the moment. "The station has a communication array," she said. "High range. It can reach Proxima Terminal and beyond with acceptable latency." A pause, during which the amber-lit planet turned its slow turn beyond the hull and the stars held their ancient positions. "The expedition returns in 51 days. We will pass within communication range of several populated stations." Joseph looked at her for a moment. "Are you giving me a schedule?" "I am giving you," she said carefully, "a direction." He picked up his bag. He looked at the docking arm. He looked back at her. He thought briefly and sincerely about what his life had looked like 11 days ago. The lukewarm coffee, the indifferent terminal, the budget freighter to nowhere particularly interesting, the accumulated smallness of a routine that had never once surprised him into laughter. He thought about 11. He thought about the drift. 51 days, he said. 51, she confirmed. "I'll need something to do in the meantime." "You are a logistics coordinator," Haley said, with that precise pause before the word that he had stopped trying to interpret and started simply receiving, like a frequency he didn't need to translate to understand. "I expect you will find a way to be useful." He laughed, real, sudden, helpless in the best way. And she watched him do it with the expression he had no full word for, the one that was attentive and warm and privately certain, the one that looked like someone watching something they are glad exists in the world. He walked down the docking arm. At the end of it, just before the station's airlock, he turned. Haley was still standing at the junction, arms uncrossed, one hand at her chest pocket where the boarding pass was. She did not wave. She did not call after him. She simply stood there the way she stood everywhere, as if she had always intended to be precisely there, and looked at him with those dark eyes across the length of the docking arm. He nodded once. She nodded once. He stepped through the airlock. The station received him with the busy indifference of places that process arrivals all day long, and he stood for a moment in the general flow of it, the noise and the light and the ordinary complexity of a place full of people going somewhere they had planned to go. He was a man with one bag and no current itinerary and a star chart in his hand printed in blue ink, standing in a station that orbited a planet glowing amber at the edges, 51 days from a direction he intended to follow. He found the communication array on the station map in under 4 minutes. Logistics. He was already composing the message as he walked. Yes, friends, we've come to the end of another adventure. If you enjoyed our story, please don't forget to click the like button. Leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next sci-fi traveler story. See you soon, friends. Take care.